Venezuela from paradise to hell? The complete story picture. This a country so wealthy that gasoline was practically free, where citizens enjoyed the lowest inequality in Latin America, and prosperity seemed endless. Now imagine that same nation transformed into a living nightmare, where people fight over bread, hospitals operate by smartphone flashlight, and millions flee for survival. This isn't fiction. This is Venezuela's tragic descent from one of the world's richest countries to a modern-day catastrophe. How did this happen? Let's find out. The Golden Age, oil discovery, and early prosperity. Our story begins in 1922 when Dutch geologists discovered something extraordinary beneath Venezuelan soil. Massive oil reserves flowing at an unprecedented 100,000 barrels per day. This discovery would change everything. Within years, hundreds of foreign companies flooded into Venezuela, and under dictator Juan Vicente Gómez, the country rapidly became the world's second largest oil exporter, producing over 137 million barrels annually. Only the United States produced more. But this blessing came with a curse. Venezuela was transforming into what economists call a petro-state, suffering from Dutch disease. Let me explain what these terms mean because they're crucial to understanding Venezuela's collapse. A petro-state has four defining characteristics. First, government income relies heavily on oil and gas exports. Second, economic and political power concentrates in an elite minority. Third, corruption runs rampant at every level. And fourth, political institutions remain weak and unaccountable. Venezuela checked every single box almost immediately after discovering oil, and tragically still does today. Russia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are other famous examples of petro-states. Dutch disease describes an economy that revolves entirely around exploiting natural resources while completely neglecting other sectors like agriculture and manufacturing. Here's how it works. Massive foreign capital flows in when oil is discovered, strengthening local currency and making imports cheaper. Leaders then commit everything to oil production while abandoning other industries. They maximize profits from the most lucrative sector and use those resources to import whatever else the country needs. Sounds logical, right? It's actually a death trap. Neglected sectors experience rising unemployment. The country becomes increasingly dependent on imports while simultaneously becoming dependent on oil exports. It's a toxic, economically devastating cycle. This system can theoretically stay afloat as long as oil keeps pumping and prices remain high. But if oil prices suddenly drop, disaster strikes. The country lacks funds for imports while also lacking domestic industry because it's been systematically destroyed. Democracy and rising wealth. Despite these structural problems, Venezuela initially thrived. Gómez's successors imposed stricter regulations on foreign oil companies, and in 1943, they passed a law requiring foreign companies to give half their profits to the state. Venezuela's income increased sixfold overnight. In 1958, Venezuela elected its first democratic government. Three major parties signed a pact distributing state jobs and oil revenues proportionally based on voting results, while seemingly democratic. This ensured oil profits remained concentrated in state hands. Then came 1973, and the Yom Kippur War. When OPEC issued an embargo on countries supporting Israel, oil prices quadrupled. Venezuela became Latin America's richest country per capita, and remained South America's wealthiest nation throughout the 1970s and 80s, ranking among the world's 20 richest countries. This wealth transformed citizens' lives. Venezuela boasted the lowest economic inequality and highest industrial growth rate in the region. By 2000, the country had a GDP of nearly $123 billion, with a solid 3.4% growth rate. But beneath this prosperity, rot was spreading. The corruption epidemic. Corruption wasn't new to Venezuela, it had always existed. But there was so much money flowing through the system that tracking it became impossible, and oversight was non-existent. From top officials to low-level local authorities, bribery became everyday practice. The numbers are staggering. Analysts at the Carter Institute estimate that between 1972 and 1997, approximately $100 billion was embezzled, and that's just the money they could account for. The 1980s oil crisis. First warning signs. Remember how I said a petro-state can remain stable as long as oil prices don't plummet? Well, in the 1980s, the world experienced a massive oil glut, a huge crude oil surplus. After peaking at $35 per barrel, about $138 in today's money, prices crashed to below $10 in 1986, roughly $29 today. The cause? The 1973 and 1979 oil crisis had slowed the global economy, reducing oil demand. Venezuela's economy was a chair standing on a single leg, and that leg was oil. Remove the leg, and everything collapses. This is exactly what Dutch disease symptoms warn against. You cannot put all your eggs in one oily basket and expect to survive when that basket catches fire. Venezuela's economy went into freefall while inflation simultaneously soared. President Jaime Lucinchi made things worse by purchasing foreign refineries, adding foreign debt to an already strained budget. Carlos Andrés Pérez and the Caracazo in 1989. Carlos Andrés Pérez was re-elected after previously serving as president in the 1970s. The country he inherited was unrecognizable from just a decade earlier. Once among the world's richest, Venezuela now had a 70% poverty rate, $34 billion in national debt, and only $300 million in international reserves. Immediately after taking office, Pérez launched a fiscal austerity package as part of an IMF bailout. Venezuelans saw this as betrayal. Pérez had campaigned on abundance, calling IMF economists genocide workers in the pay of economic totalitarianism. He'd said their policies were bombs that kill people. Now he was implementing those exact policies. The state reduced fuel subsidies and increased public transportation fees by 30%. But the real breaking point was reducing gasoline subsidies. For decades, Venezuelans had paid among the world's lowest gas price, about 13 US cents per gallon in the 1970s. Riots erupted in what became known as the Caracazo, lasting 6 days from late February to early March 1989. Authorities used disproportionate force, especially in poor neighborhoods, resulting in at least 2,000 deaths, with independent estimates reaching 5,000. One name emerged from this chaos that would shape Venezuela's future: Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, the architect of disaster, using the Caracazo as justification. Chavez launched 2 coup attempts in 1992. Both failed, but Chavez gained international fame. In 1998, he was elected president, and soon everything would get much worse. Chavez ran on a socialist platform, promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. Instead, he launched a 4-pronged assault on his own economy through terrible macroeconomic policies, even worse microeconomic policies, corruption, and poorly planned social programs. These social programs, called Bolivarian Missions, became his administration's centerpiece. Over 30 programs aimed at helping vulnerable social sectors, guaranteeing basic health services, education, food, and housing. But corruption poisoned everything. Chavez convinced Venezuelans that the presidential term needed extending to 6 years, and that he needed more power to implement these missions. For the first time in Venezuelan history, the constitution was approved by referendum, and in 2000, Chavez was re-elected. The Bolivarian missions were riddled with scandals. The IMF criticized Chavez for diverting significant amounts to private pockets. The mission's long-term sustainability was questioned, since they depended entirely on oil prices and exports. Venezuela had learned nothing from the 1980s oil glut. The quality of work was terrible. The College of Engineers of Venezuela warned about subsidized homes being built. By 2013, decade-old buildings showed massive faults, collapsing walls, unsupported plasterwork, cracks everywhere. Rushed work meant infrastructure built under Bolivarian missions was incredibly poor quality. This pattern spread across all missions. Everything was rushed to show immediate results, so Chavez could ensure re-election. It worked temporarily, people saw results, and Chavez retained support. The economic boom that wasn't macroeconomically. Venezuela's economy experienced a boom, but this wasn't due to smart politics. It was a side effect of a global commodity supercycle extended high prices for basic goods like grain, metal, and oil. Instead of saving during good times like Norway does, Venezuela increased spending. Unlike Norway, which saves oil revenue for bad times, Venezuela ran double-digit deficits while the economy boomed, consistently outspending its income to cover losses. The government raised external debt sixfold and burdened the state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela PDVSA, with over 100 billion in obligation. And if that wasn't enough, they tried the trick we all thought would work when we were children, simply printing more money. The central bank started printing money, and the inevitable happened. Inflation rose. While it worked as a tax on savings and wages through higher consumer prices, it mostly hurt the poorest people, the very people Chavez claimed to help. The government brought back fuel and gas subsidies, making gasoline not only the cheapest in the world but essentially free. Electricity subsidies were also massive, leading to losses and underinvestment, destroying the oil industry. Even though the oil sector was not only the most important, but the only sector with long-term viability, carrying Venezuelan industry on its back, Chavez seemed determined to destroy it. Investment in the oil sector was minimal. When PDVSA workers went on strike, he fired thousands. After crippling literally the most important company in the country, he replaced experienced technical experts with cronies and political allies. Oil production fell rapidly from around 3 million barrels per day at the turn of the century to about 2.3 million barrels per day when Chavez died in 2013. While strategic petroleum reserves dwindled and government debt more than doubled, Chavez's microeconomic policies delivered the final blow. War on the private sector. The government was incredibly hostile toward the private sector and private property. Chavez made this hostility public through many televised expropriations, usually with no compensation to owners. This sent a clear message: take your business elsewhere. It stopped foreign investors interested in anything besides oil from investing. Nationalization swept across millions of hectares of land and firms in various sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, retail, banking, telecommunications. Nothing escaped Chavez's iron grip. The government essentially secured a black market for currency trading through capital controls. Multiple official exchange rates existed where the government subsidized dollar purchases. For example, exchange controls would sell dollars at 6.3 bolivars for priority goods like food and medicine, while less important goods got a rate of 200 bolivars per dollar. This naturally created a black market with its own exchange rates, birthing thousands of ghost companies whose only purpose was lobbying the government for subsidized dollars, which they'd resell on the black market for profit. Part of this money filled Chavez's pockets. This was another way Chavez crushed legitimate businesses which couldn't get reliable access to foreign currencies needed to operate. Many closed permanently, others pivoted toward activities securing better exchange rates. The government set price caps for thousands of retail goods: rice, chicken, soap, bread, toilet paper. All had low price caps that ultimately put producers out of business since they couldn't cover costs. This also increased crime as people were forced to smuggle basic goods just to survive. In 2011, the government capped profits too, with inventory seizures and jail time for workers and executives. Parks and recreation was unironically correct. If you make too much money, straight to jail. This insanely dysfunctional framework left massive gaps for corruption. An estimated $300 billion was lost to corrupt politicians and officials. The government invested $700 billion into Bolivarian Missions, of which at least half remains unaccounted for today. International relations and authoritarianism. Under Chavez, Venezuela developed tense international relations. In 2009, a U.S. government accountability office report stated drug trafficking was rampant and officials refused to cooperate with the United States. Venezuela aided Colombian paramilitary group FARC, by producing and trafficking drugs on Venezuelan territory. To prepare for potential war, Chavez opened credit lines with Russia to purchase 98 T-72 tanks and an S-300 anti-aircraft system. Perhaps worst of all, Chavez turned Venezuela into a de facto autocratic state. After extending the presidential term to 6 years, a 2009 referendum removed term limits, restricting presidents to 2 terms. Chavez was serving his 3rd term when he died in 2013. He harassed journalists and ran independent outlets out of the country. In 2007, Chavez tried changing the constitution to allow the president to suspend media rights and detain citizens without charges during states of emergency. This referendum thankfully didn't pass, but it was incredibly close, 51 to 49%. Hugo Chavez paved the way toward complete dictatorship before his death on March 5th, 2010. Nicolás Maduro, making things even worse. If you thought it couldn't get worse, you were wrong. Chavez was succeeded by Nicolás Maduro, his close ally. Maduro was a union leader who became foreign minister under Chavez and later his vice president. Venezuela was divided during the first election, with Maduro barely winning by 1.5%. His presidency, still ongoing at recording time, was somehow even worse than Chávez's, drowning Venezuela's hopes of economic recovery even further. One of his first decisions was creating the Vice Ministry of Supreme Happiness to coordinate social programs. Not much else about his presidency could be found amusing. Remember how petro-states suffering from Dutch disease are vulnerable to oil price changes. Venezuela learned nothing from the 1980s. The economy wasn't diversified under Chavez. They'd spent 15 years spending and stealing wildly. The country had no savings and was massively indebted. As soon as Maduro took power, global oil prices started dropping. In summer 2014, prices were around $100 per barrel. By Christmas, they dropped to $50 a. By 2016, barely $30 per barrel. This absolutely devastated Venezuela. It was the worst possible thing that could happen to the country. Doubling down on failure, the IMF and other organizations suggested Maduro repeal currency, price, and profit controls. He ignored expert economists and doubled down on policies created by his mentor. Even though the country barely had dollar reserves and couldn't afford the frankly stupid system, the government continued assigning dollars at subsidized exchange rates. From 2015 to 2016, GDP dropped by a colossal 17%. In 2010, it dropped another 16%. Maduro refused to change economic policy. Just like Chavez, he tried the let's just print more money trick. The central bank expanded money supply by an unbelievable 20 to 30% per month. This sent Venezuela into hyperinflation. In 2015, inflation hit 81%, the highest in the world in the country's history at the time. In 2017, prices rose 50% per month as inflation climbed over 4,000%. In 2018, it climbed over 23,000%, making it the 23rd most severe hyperinflation episode in history. Economist Ricardo Hassmann wrote that Venezuela's collapse was unprecedented in the Western world. Between 2017, Venezuela's GDP contracted more severely than the US during the Great Depression and more than Russia, Cuba, and Albania after communism's fall. Humanitarian catastrophe, the human cost, was devastating. The minimum monthly wage could only meet 1/10 of basic food needs. People fought in streets over bread. Endless lines hoping to buy food filled the streets. Children picked through dumpsters hoping to find something to eat. 74% of the population lost an average of 19 pounds. 80% of medicines were unavailable. Hospitals lacked basic equipment and minimum hygiene. Surgeons operated using smartphone flashlights to see. Women gave birth outside hospitals. Infant mortality rose 100%. Malaria and diphtheria, diseases eradicated in most countries, spread everywhere. Caracas became the planet's most dangerous city with some of the world's highest per capita murder rates. Since 2010, when it had the world's highest murder rate, higher than Baghdad during the Iraq War, Caracas has remained among the world's most dangerous cities, with 98% of crimes unsolved. In 2017, Venezuela was second only to El Salvador in homicide rates with 89 per 100,000 inhabitants. Caracas had 132 murders per 100,000. The authorities were no better than criminals. Amnesty International reported nearly 8,300 executions in Venezuela's poor neighborhoods during protests between 2005 and 2017. In 1 year, 22% of all homicides were carried out by Venezuelan security forces. 22%. 1 in 5 of all murders. To seek better lives, millions fled. Since 2017, at least 7.7 million Venezuelans left their homes, mostly for Chile, Colombia, Peru, and the United States. By decade's end, GDP per capita had shrunk by an unbelievable 61%, making Venezuela's collapse the 15th largest economic collapse in history outside war, revolution, or state collapse. Maduro's path to dictatorship. Maduro edged closer to dictatorship. Obviously uninterested in giving up power, he essentially cheated during 2018 election. Many Venezuelan NGOs, the EU, US, Lima Group, Australia, and OAS rejected the electoral process, with thousands of reports of vote buying. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran recognized the process. That says everything. Countries rejecting it recognized opposition figure Juan Guaidó, National Assembly head at the time, as Venezuela's interim leader. Maduro didn't accept this. At this point, Venezuela was on its knees. Its oil industry, the economy's most important pillar, was collapsing. Currency controls became money laundering cornerstones while strangling the private sector. Private investment was virtually non-existent. International sanctions and further collapse. In 2019, a US-led international task force tried ousting Maduro. Beyond not recognizing him as legitimate president, they imposed severe economic sanctions, attempting to make corrupt leadership collapse from within. The primary mechanism was cutting Venezuela off from the US oil market. A year later, Trump imposed secondary sanctions on PDVSA, subjecting every country doing business with PDVSA to US sanctions. Venezuela was basically cut off from world markets. Oil production fell from 500,000 barrels per day before sanctions to just 337,000 barrels daily in 2020, less than a year later. The economy reached new lows, having shrunk 73% since the crisis began in 2014. Maduro's regime stayed afloat by doing business with Russia, Iran, Turkey, China, and Cuba. The regime increased its power grip by taking control of the National Assembly, the last opposition-controlled political body, the last pillar of hope for reason in the country. The US, Canada, EU, and OAS condemned this, stating the election was fraudulent. Maduro didn't care about international sanctions because Venezuela found safety nets in powerful countries still willing to do business. Despite that, times had never been worse. In 2020, GDP growth was negative 30% and hyperinflation reached 300,000%. COVID-19 added another disaster layer atop the hellish humanitarian crisis. 33% of Venezuelans skipped one meal daily, and 12% went entire days without food. Poverty reached 91%, and as of 2021, 67% lived in extreme poverty. Venezuela ranked 24th out of 25 Latin America and Caribbean countries in prosperity, according to the UK-based Legatum Institute. Only Haiti fared worse. Crime networks and state complicity. Crime in Venezuela transcends presidency, unchanged under Chavez and Maduro. The crime network is vast. If you think of any horrible criminal activity, it's probably happening in Venezuela. Venezuela became a major human trafficking hub. Both domestic and foreign victims are exploited, often sexually, and sold to other Latin American countries. Women are especially vulnerable, lured with false promises of leaving the homeland for better opportunities, only to find themselves in criminal groups' clutches, forced to produce cocaine or used as slaves. Trafficking goes hand in hand with extortion. Fake kidnappings are prevalent, with families paying but never seeing loved ones again. Illegal weapons are easily attainable, with the government playing a monumental role. Most bullets used by smugglers and gangs come from state-owned firearm manufacturers, with officials surely receiving sales cuts. Security forces sell their own arms and seized weapons on black markets. At least a quarter of the entire market consists of counterfeit products, suits, purses, electronics, pharmaceuticals, mostly from China and Russia. Oil smuggling continues despite dwindling national reserves and rising prices. Today's main actors are state officials and key oil industry players who can access whatever little oil remains. This has resulted in billions in losses in recent years alone. Gold and mineral smuggling is rampant. Venezuela has the greatest number of illegal mining spots among all Amazonian rainforest countries. Gangs run mines, often using trafficking victims for dirty work. The key factor across all crime sectors is that actors are usually state officials, police officers, military officers, government officials. Seemingly no state official actually upholds law. They're not only facilitating criminal enterprises through their positions, but also providing protection to the entire criminal framework. The current situation and future outlook in 2023, Maduro agreed to hold free and fair presidential elections in 2023. In exchange, Washington eased sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas sector for 6 months, resulting in production increases. In 2024, the Venezuelan government failed to meet basic conditions for fair voting and even started an ancient territorial dispute over the oil-rich Essequibo region with Guyana. Washington reimposed sanctions because Maduro simply cannot be trusted. In July 2024, both Maduro and the opposition claimed victory. The opposition published over 80% of legitimate voting tallies. Since the government controls Venezuela's internet, these couldn't be shown publicly. Voting tallies verified by several foreign independent analysts showed opposition candidate Edmundo González Urrutia winning by landslide, receiving 67% of the vote. National Electoral Council, now Maduro's personal property, declared Maduro the clear winner. The government issued a warrant for González Urrutia's arrest after he posted voting tallies online, forcing him to flee the country. In September 2024, mass protests erupted, met with disproportionate force by security forces and pro-government militias. At least 2,400 people were arrested for arbitrary reasons. The common denominator? All 2,400 participated in protests. Political violence rose dramatically as Maduro dropped all pretenses of due process and democracy, openly showing that Chavez broke ground for autocracy and he's now building a dictatorial powerhouse. Maduro, drunk on power and entirely committed to serving as president for life, became a thorn in America's eye, officially for trafficking cocaine, but unofficially because Venezuela still holds oil production potential and has gotten too close to Russia and China. President Trump doubled the U.S. bounty for Maduro to $50 million. At recording time, the U.S. military enveloped Venezuela with at least 10 warships and over 4,500 sailors and Marines, with USS Gerald R. Ford joining the combat group. That's 8% of the U.S. Navy's entire global fleet. This results from Maduro refusing to step down, which the U.S. has tried achieving for years. According to sources, Washington even offered Maduro and his inner circle safe haven in another country if he'd step down peacefully. The offer was rejected. Every day it looks more likely that Maduro, on top of leading his country into one of the modern age's worst humanitarian crises, is leading Venezuela into war against arguably the planet's most powerful military force. Conclusion is the hope. The most apparent Venezuelan crisis is democracy's crisis, begging the question, is there a way out for the Venezuelan people? Most experts agree Maduro is obsessed with power. He won't relinquish it peacefully. Violent revolution or violent outside intervention appears just a matter of time. The bigger question is who fills the Maduro-shaped hole? Even if Maduro stepped down this moment, the country still faces massive crime and corruption problems. Stakeholders in this criminal network don't want just and fair government. They want someone exactly like Maduro and Chavez. More than just new government. Venezuela needs to wipe the board clean and build their economy from scratch. Beyond revamping its constitution and reinstating robust democratic pillars, it needs to diversify its economy, perhaps looking to Norway, which carefully monitors production and doesn't allow petroleum to account for more than 20% of GDP. However, this requires massive foreign investment and would take considerable time to see results, leaving even leading experts uncertain about the future of this once rich country. Venezuela's story serves as a cautionary tale about resource curses, corruption's devastating power, and how quickly prosperity can turn to despair when leadership prioritizes personal gain over national welfare. From paradise to hell, Venezuela's transformation stands as one of modern history's most tragic economic and humanitarian disasters.